Chapter 20. The Truth About the EU. www.youtrust.org.uk states that the EU costs us over £300 billion per annum, which equates to 25% of the economy. It also states that Parliament acted illegally against the wishes of the nation's people for 43 years. They claimed that many senior British politicians and civil servants are bribed, accept patronage and salaries to be pro-EU. This is probably true. The British Constitution only allows MPs to implement the wishes of the people. Conservative MPs voted for Theresa May to be their new leader, and she is the current British Prime Minister because of this, although it has been pointed out that because of the signing off of the new snooping charter, government spies on phone calls and emails and website visits, in November 2016, which had to be signed off by royalty also, that she is probably a Bilderberger. There are 4 ways to leave the EU, and the most covered within the controlled media in the UK is to trigger Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty. In his resignation speech, David Cameron, Bilderberger, refused to implement the voted-for wishes of the British people. He delayed it for Theresa May to implement. The EU's 120,000 regulations cost over £100 billion a year to implement. Such regulations have closed many British businesses. Britain has 8,500 EU-mandated and pointless quangos where the directors are paid up to £700,000 a year to procure their agreement to the EU. The Cabinet Office reports that this will save £210 billion once we escape. This is a combined total saving of £325 billion over a year. The VAT rate is controlled by the EU. When we leave, we could afford to abolish it. It raises £90 billion a year. The EU stops us trading freely with 93% of the world. Apparently in 1973, New Zealand drove 3 million sheep off their cliffs and into the sea because Britain was no longer allowed to buy them in quantity. Youtrust claimed that the EU was partly forced upon people by the secret societies, including 8 Bilderbergers in the cabinet since Edward Heath's time. Senior Freemasonry supports the EU agenda, especially in the courts, as does Common Purpose. Youtrust stated 28 reasons to leave the EU. As we have thankfully decided to leave the EU, I will list only some of the more interesting ones. The EU has an unelected 3-tiered dictatorship based on the Soviet model with a sham parliament based in Brussels. The EU has bribed 28 prime ministers with £10 million per treaty to sign away their nations and their freedom. The above is why the establishment is wholly in favour of the EU. Edward Heath's bribe was money laundered to him as a Nobel Peace Prize. The EU's massive immigration, 336,000 net migrations to the UK reported yesterday, means that the English will become a minority in their own nation in 9 years. With the English birth rate at 1.3 children per couple and immigrants having an average of 8 children, in 20 years the English will be a minority. The EU's immigration laws mean that we can't stop terrorists coming into Britain, or can we deport them? The EU started with 6 nations and now, by bribing leaders, it has 28. The EU is a military union. The Lisbon Treaty orders us to hand over our army, navy and Royal Air Force and nuclear weapons to the EU. The EU has been misrepresenting the peaceful President Putin by making him out to be the enemy, which is the controlled media precursor to war. Russia supplies the EU with much of its energy. The EU is just 7% of the world. Can you imagine the trade deals with the other 93%? We entered the EU as the world's 3rd largest economy. We are now the world's 9th largest economy and lose £70 billion a year by trading with the EU. The EU is corrupt. It cannot account for 95% of its expenditure. Bribery is massive. Most of Britain's laws are now EU laws. EU corpus juris replaced common law in 1992. The EU arrest warrant allows you to be dragged away to another EU country and to languish in their prisons with no judge or jury. The EU's compliance and restraint order systems allow the government to close your bank account and keep your money on the whim of a government official with no judge, jury and no justice. The EU has controlled the Conservative and Labour parties for 20 years. The most successful nations in Europe are not in the EU. Switzerland, 8 million population, and Norway, 5 million population, don't have the euro or its problems like Greece have had. According to Youtroth, 95% of crime is committed by the government, and yet people believe them and still vote for them and obey them. The invasion of Iraq being one example. William Hague, Bilderberger and former Foreign Secretary, was desperate to silence the chief prosecution witness, Julian Assange, whose website, WikiLeaks, published documentation that convicts implements them. It used to be the gangsters that permanently silenced the witnesses, not government employees paid by the public taxpayer to serve on behalf of the public. In 1999, the government deregulated the banks, making them massive fraud machines, creating bubbles in markets that they knew would burst, rewarding criminality by allowing billions in bonuses for failure. Only in the lunatic asylum could this happen. Their goal is political engineering in order to impoverish us. On the orders of the EU masters, our bribed politicians have closed down heavy industry and swamped the nation with immigrants. The nation that consists of a few tiny islands. The police, Crown Prosecution Service and judges are mostly Freemasons, and Britain's courts are utterly corrupt. The National Health Service, NHS, is controlled by common purpose who are a government quango who through their abolition of established procedures cause 60,000 preventable deaths in the NHS every year. 100,000 are apparently murdered on the Liverpool care pathway, 450,000 die inside the NHS annually. There is evidence that the government has committed a number of murders, including WMD scientist John Kelly, Foreign Secretary Robin Cook and Labour leader John Smith, because they refused to go along with their criminality. Youtroth commented that together with Churchill, King George VI saved our nation and was a monarch to be proud of, but his daughter, the current Queen, is the only monarch to have broken all her coronation oaths by signing 6 treaties that abolish common law, the British Constitution, the British and English nations and sovereignty. She has committed treason together with co-signatories Ted Heath, Margaret Thatcher, John Major, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Interestingly, Tony Blair and the Queen signed the Crime and Disorder Act, 1998, which secretly abolished much of the crime of treason and reduced the penalty to life imprisonment. 1.4 million British servicemen gave their life for independence, which has been thrown away. Youtroth claims that between the ages of 12 and 22, her political and constitutional tutor was Sir Henry Martin, who was a Fabian communist, and that she was trained for subversion and treason. Youtroth also claims that the Queen is a member of the Illuminati, a Bilderberger and a Freemason, and that she serves a Dark Master.